fathers, our granddad, our great-granddad, our brother, our uncle, and our cousins and friends, celebration of his life. So we've got a whole agenda planned today, and in Roy style, we got it on a napkin. But it's not a co-op napkin, it's an Amigos Cantina napkin, so good quality stuff. Two-sided. Two-sided, we've got some arrows and some circles, and it does not say anything about the flow of capital in our global economy, but hopefully it brings us all kinds of fun. But there's something that we always had to promise the Fresco Hotel, and because this is where some history was made about 47 years ago. So Frank Dietz is in the house. I see Stuart Thiessen. Lauren Scholin, where are you? Shout out, Lauren. Is Lauren here?
He's late.
He's late. Wow. So in order to hold this event at the Beds, we had to make some assurances to the management, because apparently, although the hotel has changed hands, the hotel has a long memory. Long memory. So we had to promise that Lauren Scholin, Frank Dietz, and Stuart Thiessen did not come to town with a load of rotten grain, that they will stay away from the fresh air intake. Yeah? You guys know what I'm talking about. So, I just want you to know, we're watching you. Okay? So we've got a whole agenda planned, and have fun. That's what we're all here to do. We've got, as Dad would have said, he had a long life, and we've got 92 years of material. And we have material. So, without further ado, welcome, and I'm going to throw the mic over to Lita, who's going to be the border collie and keep us on task here.
Thanks, Wendy. Good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Viva Atkinson. I'm one of the 5 genetic kids, and one of the more that weren't genetic that Mom and Dad that stayed at Mom and Dad's house and raised and were influenced by his presence. So, years ago, I was in this social setting and I was asked to describe my family in one sentence. And as the people were making the rounds and saying how they were, the nature and the culture of their family, I described the nature and the culture of my family in that on any social occasion, a meeting might break out. So today, in addition to being the border collie, I'm the chairperson. And I'm just going to give you a few quick details about the agenda. So for today's program, it should last about an hour, and we're going to have Roberta's story come up and talk about her remembrances of her brother. Bill Wardell, a friend of Dad's, is going to give a eulogy. Marty Staples, who grew up in Springwater on a farm not far from ours, is going to have a poem. That's going to be followed by a contribution of the grandchildren. Then we have a video that's broken down into kind of Dad's work life and his family life. So that video will play. Then Pat will say a few words. And then we're going to finish up with my brothers Bob and Mike performing an interpretive dance. So the program is not without arts. So what I need this napkin agenda. We need a motion.
I so move.
Okay, we need a seconder.
I second.
Stuart, okay, we've got a seconder. Those in favor? Carried. So at the conclusion of the formal part of the program, the family would like to meet and be able to visit with all of you that have gathered here. Some have come great distances, and we really do appreciate that. So And if you don't, there's so many people that asked to speak today, we really couldn't rent the room long enough. So if you'd like to leave your remembrances on Star Phoenix obituary page, that would be great. And then in that way you can share them with us. So I'd like to ask my Aunt Roberta, one of Dad's 7 beautiful sisters, to come up.
Now, if you can't hear me, just wait. Or if you don't want to hear me, go like this. Okay. When Lena phoned and asked me to speak at the memorial celebration of my brother Roy's life, I felt very honored and humble. What could I say? After pondering this question, the answer suddenly came to me. Much had been written about Roy's accomplishments as a social activist and farm advocate during his adult life, but little was known about his childhood or his teen years that helped him to develop into the thoughtful, dynamic man he had become. Roy was born on the family farm, which was located on Section 32, Township 35, Range 17, west of the 3rd Meridian. He was always proud of that. North of Springwater. He entered this world in the northeast bedroom on the 2nd floor of the family home. Attending his birth was my mother, a Dr. DeBovery, and a local midwife. He arrived a bouncing 10-pound boy, the eldest of what was to be a family of 10. His proud parents were Elsie and Robert Atkinson. Roy was a resourceful child, a deep and unique thinker with an unusual imagination. At the age of 2, he was prone to uttering only 1 or 2 words at a time. Then things changed. Lugging a 10-pound pail of honey up the front steps and into the house, he exclaimed excitedly, "Look, Mom, look what Dad brought home from town." That, according to my mother, was Roy's first sentence. After that earth-shaking event, he became a very verbal little boy who developed into an impressive orator. Was he resourceful and capable of solving problems? Oh, yes. He was about 5 years old, and while in the yard playing, he was given the task of caring for his little sister, Lavon, and he was admonished to keep her out of harm's way. Roy, being a Roy, agreed to do so, since he really had no choice but to obey. Lavon was about 2 and a very tiny little mite. Roy looked around the yard, hoping to find a solution to his problem, so that he could keep on playing while keeping her safe. His eyes fell upon the clothesline, and he was suddenly inspired. Grabbing some clothespins, he lifted Lavon up and pinned her by her clothes onto the clothesline. Lavon giggled and chuckled and waved happily as a strong breeze pushed her back and forth. All was well. However, his unique solution to his problem was discovered, and Lavon was quickly removed from the clothesline. At age 6, it was off to school. He took grades 1 and 8 at Bushville, a small country school. Grades 9 and 10 at Finbury Church, which was also served as a school. Then it was back to Bushville for high school, grade 11 and 12. The basement of that school had been converted into a high school. The upper floor was used to teach grades 1 to 8, while the basement was used to educate those from 9 to 12. Roy did well at school, and his gift as an orator emerged very early. In grade 3 or 4, he won his first medal at an oratory contest held at Springwater. He continued to win first place in all succeeding competitions that he entered. I will never forget the shivers that raced up and down my spine when that compelling timbre of his voice as he recited the poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee. Nor have I ever forgotten the thundering applause he received from the audience. Of course, he won that competition. Roy played hockey and baseball. He also belonged to the 4-H club. I'm sure that those activities helped him to develop his sense of justice and fair play. Growing up on the farm, there was always plenty to do. Roy helped with farm chores, stooped, cut, and stacked hay, helped with seeding, poisoning gophers, and harvesting. There was no time for boredom. Roy loved to sing, and in the evening we often gathered around the piano to sing. Many will recall Roy singing Solidarity Forever at union get-togethers. He always sang this theme song with great gusto. In his late teens or early 20s, Roy was smitten by a comely Irish lass named Betty Aylward. Betty's family farmed near Dupro. Betty was an excellent athlete, an inspiring, popular, and well-liked school teacher. Besides teaching her students the required curriculum, Betty taught her students the importance of honesty, fairness, and integrity. Roy wooed Betty with great enthusiasm. The Dupro community also aided him in his quest. When Roy took the cattle truck with his high rack to call him Betty, it was reported to the bigger detachment of the RCMP that there were cattle rustlers in the area. What excitement for a small community. The local municipal council jokingly discussed ways to ensure that the roads would be kept passable so that Roy's and Betty's romance would not be interfered with. Betty eventually resigned from her teaching position, and she and Roy left for the West Coast that autumn after harvest. While there, they were married. After working at the coast for the winter, they returned to farm life in the spring. They found accommodation in a house near Springwater, and that is where they started their family and continued actively farming. In 1955, our mother was widowed. Roy, without complaint, took on the added responsibility of the home farm and also helped with his youngest siblings. This was a very heavy load for a young man of 30 to assume on top of the responsibilities he had for his own wife and his children. Betty and Roy were an amazing team. Betty was a strong, highly intelligent, capable, independent woman, very supportive of Roy in his many endeavors. It was these characteristics of Betty that made it possible for her to cope with raising 5 lively children while directing, managing, and helping with the farm operation, aided by a reliable farm hand when Roy was so often away. I'm sure that level-headed Betty would suggest that he stop and think more deeply about different issues that he was involved in. I also think that she was often the one with sober second thoughts. What a couple. Last Tuesday, after learning of Roy's passing, my grandson Dominic said, "Uncle Roy taught me a lot, and when I have children and grandchildren, I will tell them what they did for farmers. Uncle Roy was a good man." As Mark Antony said in Shakespeare's play when he spoke of Julius Caesar, "He was my friend, faithful and just to me." I can truthfully say, Roy was my brother, faithful and just to me. Roy's life was well lived, and he would be missed by many.
I had a very quick lunch with some of my nephews today, and they specifically asked if we would treat this in the manner that we started, that it's a meeting. If you enjoy the words being spoken, please clap. Outside of our family circle, Roy cast a wide net and had an eclectic group of friends and people in his life. It always fascinated us that Dad had friends of all ages, all persuasions, all political parties. He held his old activist friends and longtime friends dear and held special regard for them. His face would soften when he spoke of them. And he had young friends that kept him cool and current. Dad became familiar with the internet, with Facebook, and quite adept at FaceTiming. So we'd like to hear from one of his friends next, and that's Bill Wardell. Bill is a Saskatoon lawyer and raises beef.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, family and friends of Roy Atkinson. Apologize, but I got a little cold today, but I'll try to get through this. When Pat called last Friday to say that the family had met and requested Pat to call me to see if I'd say a few words, I first said no. I tried to get out of it by telling Pat that there are others that knew Roy and the family better and could more eloquently talk about his life in a more holistic way. Pat just quipped very succinctly, "No, Bill, just talk about your experience with Roy." So here it goes. I've entitled this The Roy Atkinson Education of Willie Wardell. That's what he always called me, Willie. Roy was many things to many people. Not all appreciated what Roy was doing for them, and sometimes to them. He was giving them an education. His favorite line went something like this: now, Bill, you need to understand what's really going on out there in Landis. My education started many years ago. My father had died tragically in the late fall of 1962, and our small family was devastated. To our rescue came our neighbors Beatrice and Albert True. For those who are not Farmers Union historians, Beatrice was for many years the women's president of the Saskatchewan Farmers Union. Beatrice and Albert took our cows for the winter and helped us stay on the farm through a difficult time. At or about the same time, Beatrice was instrumental in getting me involved with the Farmers Union, the CCF, and the NDP. Beatrice, as I recall, was one of the first women elected to the Saskatchewan legislature, and she served for a number of years in the Douglas government. She was a person with guts and heart, not unlike Pat Atkinson, who held many cabinet posts in Saskatchewan NDP governments. A few weeks before my grade 12 graduation, Beatrice and Albert came over one night, suggested to my mother and myself that I needed some real farm organizational education. Beatrice had lined me up to meet Roy Atkinson the next Friday night at a town hall meeting in Elrose, and then to travel with Roy for 3 days on a speaking tour in southwest Saskatchewan. So started my formal Atkinson education. After a rousing meeting in Elrose, Roy and I boarded the green Chev station wagon and headed south. First stop, the Husky truck stop in Swift Current at about 1 a.m. Roy had a steak as he hadn't eaten all day. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of town hall meetings, encounters with local union supporters, and also coping with an impromptu ice storm that made the old Chev wagon seem like it was on figure skates. Roy headed us down to cattle country with engagements in Glentworth and meetings set up in Ogama by Bud Fogel. Somehow I got back to Lemsford in one piece, but my perspective on life had changed forever. No longer did I view big corporations, grain and chemical companies as the benign folks who provided pop and hot dogs at the local sports day. Roy gave me a crash course in monopolistic powers of big corporations who manipulated farmers in their markets. I had learned a lot from Roy about the need to deal with those corporations from positions of people power, and that the job was to create fair dealing for farmers by working together. A few years later, I received a call from Roy to ask if I would be part of an experiment the union wanted to try. They wanted to hire a university summer student to sell memberships and do organizing. He said I needed a car. My grandma helped me finance the purchase of a 1960 Falcon for $600. On the first day, Roy introduced me to Frank Beeler, the union's membership coordinator. Frank took me out to Purdue and Asquith that day, and we renewed a dozen memberships. It seemed easy watching Frank deftly deal with membership renewals with farmers he obviously knew. As my wife Florence would say in the medical field, see one, do one, teach one. So Frank and Roy the next day turned me out north of Saskatoon by myself into Hague, Rostron, and Aberdeen country for the rest of the week. I should have been a bit wary about why they didn't send me any renewal slips. I was 19 years old and a little naive. I recall them sort of smiling as they wished me well on that first day as I headed out. Well, I met a great many wonderful folks in the next few days traveling around Rosthern and thereabouts. I was invited in for lunch and tea and ate all sorts of Mennonite goodies and was warmly treated. However, in the whole week I sold only 2 memberships. And those were folks named McDonald and Dunk Mackay in Aberdeen. On Friday, I returned dejectedly to the office to report on my education. Both Roy and Frank had stayed late to see how I did. They were at first polite as I explained what a nice group of people I had met, but how terribly difficult it had been to get them to join the union. Both of them couldn't hold their laughter any longer. They explained to me that it was a test. They had sent me out to some of the toughest membership canvassing areas in the province. Those local folks, based on honest, religious, and personal beliefs, did not join unions. Roy said I passed the test because I had not given up and quit. The next week, he sent me to Fox Valley, where I sold 8 to 12 memberships a day. Before long, I was promoted to work with Bill Hope in assisting farm union members who were having land expropriation disputes and lease problems with oil companies and the Department of Highways. It was part of Roy's education plan to show farmers that they needed to work together, and by working with the union and working in tandem, they could deal with oil companies and the Department of Highways. Roy was very concerned that farmers were not being treated with respect by oil companies and the like. He further opined that farmers were not getting knowledgeable legal services, and in his mind, many of the lawyers were more likely to work for larger corporations where the pay was better. He then continued my education. You see, I had originally started university with a plan to become a United Church minister. Roy, however, wondered if it would not be better for me to go to law school, so I could work for farmers battling large corporations. So the next 3 years during the summer, I worked for the union and went off to law school. During the summer of 1968, the next part of my education had a small part to do with a much bigger plan for Roy to educate a new Prime Minister named Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Roy explained that Mr. Trudeau did not understand the why and the effect of grain sales being in the tank and the cost price squeeze and what that was doing to choking farm families' income. Roy had learned that Prime Minister Trudeau had scheduled a get-acquainted trip to the prairies in mid-July and was to be meeting with the Saskatchewan wheat pool in Regina and business folks the following day in Saskatoon. Not surprisingly, from Roy's perspective, the Farmers' Union was not invited to any of these meetings. Roy decided that Mr. Trudeau ought to meet some real farmers and get a prairie education. A couple of days before Mr. Trudeau's arrival, I was sent out to Swift Current to manage tractor demonstrations on the #1 highway from Regina to the Alberta border. These demonstrations were to prepare farmers and the public for the Prime Minister's visit. At Swift Current, the RCMP were being particularly aggressive. Roy sent me in to deal with the situation. How it was to be done, he said, was up to me, as long as I had clear in my head the union's position that farmers had a civil right to demonstrate and educate by operating their tractors on a public highway. One particular heavy-handed staff sergeant west of Swift Current was intimidating our field bosses and was threatening charges if we didn't pull the tractors off the road. The weather was hot and our cause had been greatly assisted when a semi full of BC lumber overheated and lost its motor and stalled near a small creek bridge on the Trans-Canada Highway. Summer vacationers could not easily drive around the semi because of the bridge, and the traffic was backed up for miles while farmers drove their tractors amongst the traffic very, very slowly. The staff sergeant raced into our roadside camp and demanded to speak to the leader. The farmers diligently pointed him to me. He roared over to me with his squad car, his lights flashing. pulled up beside me, rolled down his window and said, "Are you responsible for these farmers blocking the highway?" I rather timidly engaged him in a courteous conversation, dutifully explaining, as I had been instructed by Roy, that the farmers were not blocking the highway, but they were simply exercising their democratic right to educate the public about the economic difficulties on the farm. He wasn't happy. He escalated his tone, lecturing me on the many legal infractions that we were committing. After 10 or 15 minutes, he threatened that if I didn't pull the tractors off the road, he would begin to ticket farmers and arrest them if we didn't cease and desist. While quietly shaking in my young boots, I politely but boldly told the officer what Roy had counseled me to say. "Well, sir, I'm the one in charge, so if you are to begin arresting people, you better start with me." To my total surprise, he didn't arrest me. He rolled up his window and spun his tires, turning on his siren, and raced in amongst the farmers and the tractors to try to further intimidate them off the highway. Curiously, while this was going on, I had noticed, while I was being berated by him, that a neighbor of mine from Lemsford, Saskatchewan, Tony Wagner, can't get in trouble anymore, he's gone, bless his heart, was standing behind the squad car. Now, Tony had never been a union member before, but Roy and the dire straits on the farm had convinced him to drive his tractor from Lemsford to Swiftburn to take part in the demonstration, the distances of 70 miles. And those were days when we didn't have cabs and air conditioning. I noticed Tony leaning up against the staff sergeant's police car and occasionally moving around the car. All the while, the staff sergeant was reading me the riot act. The conversation ended and the sergeant in the squad car spun away in disgust. I noticed that Tony had been liberally applying large green Farmers Union bumper stickers to the police car. As the car sped amongst the farmers and their tractors displaying its flashing lights and all bedecked in Farmers Union bumper stickers, the farmers howled with delight. There was no more intimidating those farmers and their tractors that day. That night, Mr. Trudeau arrived in Regina. On instructions from Roy, we had moved 300 farmers and their tractors along with a cavalcade of farm trucks into downtown Regina around the Regina Inn, where the Prime Minister was to meet with the Saskatchewan wheat pool. We occupied the streets and the parking lot. Roy requested a meeting with the Prime Minister. Roy, speaking from a grain truck in the parking lot of the Regina Inn, grimly advised the farmers that the Prime Minister was not willing to meet. The crowd got noisier and more militant. At one point, I relayed a message to some of Roy's people that tractors without mufflers might get more attention atop the Regina Inn. Somehow the mufflers came off, and it got very loud, and somehow it worked. Roy was advised that the Prime Minister would come down and speak to the farmers. Roy came to me and told me that he had made an agreement with security that we would provide a farmer-protected escort for the Prime Minister from the door of the Regina Inn, some 50 feet, to our 3-ton grain truck, which was acting as a sound stage and a speaking platform where Roy addressed the crowd at intervals. Roy advised that I should deputize a number of trusted farmer members to form a chain and guard the Prime Minister from the Regina Inn door to the sound truck. Roy leaned down and said to me, "Bill, I don't like the Prime Minister, but I don't want him hurt." I met Mr. Trudeau at the door of the Regina Inn, where the security people turned him over to us. We walked uneventfully the 40 or so feet towards the sound truck when a young boy, aged 8 or so, snuck under the outstretched arms of the guarding farmers who had linked their arms in a chain. The boy held a handful of red spring wheat, and he pasted the Prime Minister with wheat. The Prime Minister reached his hand down to the boy's shoulder and said, "Young man, I should kick your ass." At that point, we reached the sound truck. I lifted a very annoyed Prime Minister up to the truck and into the outstretched hand of Roy Atkinson, and the rest is history. Some will recall the PM said some things that day about it not being his job to sell our wheat. For decades, the only Liberal elected to Saskatchewan was the lone Mr. Goodale. Prime Minister then moved on to Saskatoon that night, and so did Roy and many of us. Miraculously, about 200 farm tractors ringed the Besborough when Mr. Trudeau awoke from his sleep. In addition, some resourceful farmers from Purdue, and Roy claimed, by the way, and we've had referenced this before, that he had absolutely nothing to do with this, had felt that some well-rotted wheat they had cleaned from a granary the day before would be perfume for the waking Prime Minister. They dumped 30, 40 bushels in front of the air intake just outside the hotel here to provide a pleasant aroma for the Prime Minister as he woke for his morning call. All this, according to Roy, was necessary, not so much to educate the politicians, but to educate the farmers about the power and the impact they could have by working together, rather than suffering alone on their farms. All of us here today have ridden on the shoulders of a giant. Roy, may you rest in peace, and may we carry on the struggle in your name and your honor. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Kind of a tough act to follow. I've known Roy all my life, and the family, the Atkinson family, the Roy families, they all go back about 100 years. Roy had many discussions over the years, and I always admired him, and he liked my poetry. So I said to him one time, would you like me to write something for you? He said, yeah, as long as you don't mention anything about Red Roy. He hated that terminology, which is put forth by a bunch of bigots. So, it took a while, but it's hard to write about a man like that. So, here's a few words that try to encompass his life, the surroundings of the prairies. I call it grassroots. Abandoned schoolyards, long overgrown, while overhead only the sound of a chemical drill. No more hired men, manure on their boots, but a sad demise to this cluster of roots. No more clean water shall drain into the land, no more the caress of an angel's hand. I spy old Roy, ahead on the rise, the stalwart figure with mist in his eyes. The longer they fought, the louder he cried, the conglomerate grip could not be pried. For all his travails on dusty streets and prairie trails, no garlands of roses lay at his feet. As he trod down old Main Street Sask, he had no choice, for this was his task. A goal of equality for all, a strong family farm. The corporate monoliths cut off his arms. Whilst all culminated in a Saskatoon street, as an arrogant Prime Minister mouthed the words, "Why should I sell your wheat?" Now beloved prairies, covered with tentacles of blacktop snakes and ribbons of steel, in a monoculture whose thirst is never slaked. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Marty. My siblings and I, our sons and daughters, routinely referred to Dad as Roy. Kind of like Cher, but fewer costume changes. Some people, I remember when I was growing up, some people thought it was disrespectful. It wasn't, and it still isn't. Roy was his name, and he loved his name, and he loved the rich history behind that name and the several generations of men who bore that name. When I was growing up, Roy was kind of my Wikipedia before Wikipedia was there. He knew stuff. I actually don't know how he knew all that stuff, and it still surprised us right up to his final days. So with that, I'd like to call on some representatives of his grandchildren, and they can give you their impression of Roy.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Atkinson. I'm the son of the other Robert Roy Atkinson. This is my cousin, Gavin. You. My grandfather was a great man. He will be remembered by most, marching shoulder to shoulder with Tommy Douglas in the fight for Medicare, standing nose to nose against Pierre Trudeau in the fight for the family farm. He was a great man. He fought for the little guy. He did so not for monetary gains, of which his Saskatoon bills in the 1990s stand as proof, or he didn't do it for fame, of which he gained because so, but because he believed that the world was a more just place when people were treated equally. In his later years, he changed his cause for which he fought, where once stood tens of thousands of individuals, many of whom he would never get the pleasure of meeting, stood 9 individuals. 9 individuals that would garner the knowledge, experiences he had gained throughout his extraordinary life. Gavin, Tyne, Balin, Shane, Jameson, Ryan, Colton, Kate, and Danny, his grandkids. The passion and conviction with which he lived his life was front and center when it came to his grandkids. The amazing things about Roy, many will say, was his ability to relate to people. This was even more apparent when it came to his relationships with his grandkids. Each of us are unique in our own way, and Grandpa knew that. He developed relationships with us that was as unique as the next. He realized our passions and used that to connect with us individually. There was never a problem or situation that could not discuss with him, and he would help you find a solution. Whether it was work, farming, school, vehicles, relationships, and of course, politics. I know my older brother talked about the debates he had with Grandpa, and like all of us, Balin soon found out that if you're going to argue with Grandpa, you better know your shit. Or else he would take you down as he had done so with many before us. Tyne tells the story of when he was needing an engine for his 1980s Camaro. He sought help from Grandpa, I'm not sure why. While Grandpa was unsure if Tyne could handle a 350 small block in his Camaro, so he found Tyne a safer option. He purchased the smallest engine he could find, a 267. Roy would also help Kate edit her essays, but his technological skills were ever evolving. He once accidentally deleted the entire essay, forcing Kate back to the drawing board. Throughout the years, our relationships with him evolved. The jokes, pranks, and overall harassment towards him from us grew every day, and he loved it. He was never one to back down from a fight, least of all to his grandkids. He would bug us as much, if not more, than we would him. Grandpa's love towards us was undeniable. He wanted nothing but for us to be the best possible versions of ourselves, and knew that for each of us it meant doing something and being someone totally different than the other grandkids. If he saw something you were doing, or more likely weren't doing, he would not hesitate to let you know. He loved to push us to be better. For myself, it was finally realizing what I wanted to do with my life. While some assumed I would not amount to much, he always saw my true potential. As soon as I told him I was thinking of going back to university to become a biologist, that was it. And he would call and ask how I was doing and push me to be better and work harder. He was not going to let me flow through it like he did with most other things in my life. He would always say to me, school is a job. You have to work. 8 hours a day minimum. He did not accept excuses or laziness. His favorite line to say to me was, remember, Jameson, it's not the size of the dog that's in the fight, but the size of the fight that's in the dog.
So, for as much as Roy tailored in each of us a unique relationship, some of his expectations were constant. For instance, it didn't matter who you were. When you walked in the front door, you lined your shoes up. But even more so, there were certain values that so fundamentally wove into his person and his politics that they soaked through his children and took root in each of us, and I'm sure many in this room. Compassion, commitment, and curiosity. To be honest, this is often where the cold boot in the ass that Jameson talked about when he pushed us a little bit came in. He wanted us to be those things. Compassion. Roy expected us to treat people with respect. But more than simply treat other people with respect, he He expected us to help out. Friends, family, strangers, it didn't matter. When they were in need and we were able to give, we were expected to do so. Many of us, I'm sure many in this room, have had the experience of Roy picking up hitchhikers. And to me, this kind of embodies how he expected us to act to strangers. One time on the way up to the farm, Roy picked up a young guy. The man was hard on his luck. He was running away from a bad situation into the unknown, which was more than likely far worse than the situation he left. When we hit bigger, Roy invited the man out for dinner with us at Snow White, I'm sure. He made sure there was plenty of leftovers that the guy could take with him on the road, and after he dropped the man at the Westwinds Hotel, he put the room on his fancy diner's card. I'm not sure how many people remember that. And slipped the guy $40. His habit of picking up hitchhikers, metaphorically and realistically, lives on through all of us. Commitment, it didn't matter what the hell you did. You were expected to stick with it and to do it well. When you started doing something, you finished. You stuck to it and you never gave up. His declaration that the day was half over when he'd call you up to drag you out of bed for breakfast embodied the belief that you worked hard with dedication, loyalty, and integrity. And finally, most interestingly, I think, he expected us to be curious about the world around us. What else could you expect from the philosopher farmer? You're expected to be curious but not careless, to critically question everything but to make sure you knew your facts. Research was key, as Roy's printer ink bills will loudly attest. Whether it was people, language, poetry, music, ideas, or travel, he didn't care for each of us what it was. He just wanted us to be curious and intrigued by our surroundings. For most of us, he'll be remembered as an intellectual giant, and he was. But to his grandkids, he's remembered as the loving and compassionate grandfather we were all so lucky to have. We're speaking for all of us when we say how incredibly fortunate we were as grandkids to have such an amazing influence in our lives.
Wow. So many people to address. I am not a public speaker normally, but I would like to inform you that Uncle Roy trained me to be a no-fear cowboy. When I walk down the street, I do not walk in fear. It was Uncle Roy who taught me that. That's it. Thank you.
Next we have a short film about 9 or 10 minutes done in two parts about Roy's working life in the first part and his family life in the second part.
Well, my job is to thank everyone very much for coming this afternoon. Those that are here know that Dad was the kind of guy that lived life in a big way. He was a force to be reckoned with, whether you were a prime minister or a premier or a government or a Cargill grain, the wheat pool, the Canadian Wheat Board, the Saskatoon Co-op, his colleagues and foes, and even his brothers and sisters and his children. For some of you, it will be hard to believe, but Dad could be sweet and tender. He was that guy that would show up unannounced if he needed to. He seemed to be on your side no matter what kind of trouble you were in, and he would be there. And that would be whether you were a niece or a nephew, or a cousin, or a sister, or a brother, his kids, his grandchildren. They had Roy when he needed to be there. And he was always in your corner no matter what, even when he had been giving you shit the day before. I have one little story to tell, and it sort of sums Dad up in lots of ways in terms of Dad and the family vacation. It was 1967, and Dad decided that he was going to take us all to Expo. He dutifully bought a trailer to hitch to the Biscayne station wagon. And he took his 4 kids and my cousin Adele, who's here today, and Mike stayed with my Aunt Dawn and Uncle Frank to Expo. He thought that we should see this, particularly because Charles de Gaulle had been in Quebec and had gone, long live Quebec. So Dad struck out in the Biscayne station wagon and the trailer, and we visited friends all the way to Montreal. And it was an interesting drive across the country, and it particularly got interesting when we got to Montreal when he needed to get off the freeway, and we were on the freeway and off the freeway and on the freeway until we got to the trailer court. And I remember it being like the Griswolds family vacation. And after driving around, which was really hours, and he wouldn't ask anybody. And my mom would say, ask, and he just would not, because he was sort of the old scout. He was going to find where this place was. He finally got us to the trailer park. He got the trailer leveled with a bit of cursing. And then he promptly flew to Vancouver because there was some strike in Vancouver. And there was my mom, who had the job of heralding us around Montreal. And Dad flew back about 5 days later and got us in the car, and he decided that we should all go to Detroit on the way home because there had been some riots in Detroit, and apparently Detroit was burning, and he thought his kids should see what the black community was doing in Detroit. And Mom was having absolutely none of this. And let's put it this way, Mom won, and we drove back to Saskatchewan. Dad got us home in one piece, and that trailer never left the farm. I want to thank you all very much for coming today. We think that we were pretty lucky to have Dad as our dad, who contributed greatly to our country and contributed greatly to our family. Dad, in many ways, taught us how to live, but he also taught us how to die. And that's what I learned in the last few months, that there is a way to die with grace and dignity, and he did so. And for that, I guess I'm really lucky that I had the chance to see Dad in his life, not all 90 years, but in 63 years of his life, but I also got to see him at the end of his life. And I'm pretty proud of the way he decided that it was time to, as he would call it, peg out. When he went to the house, or to the apartment, I say, how are you doing today? And he said, well, I'm still here, I haven't pegged out. So when he finally pegged out, it was tough, but we had a lot of fun in the last week looking at family photos and remembering. So on behalf of the Atkinson Elbert clan, thank you very much for coming. There's tea and coffee and all of Dad's favorite cookies, and let's have a good visit. Thank you.
So here's my brothers, Bob and Mike.
So those of you who are expecting us to dance, you'll be sorely disappointed. Yes, we're not going to actually dance, we're going to sing.
Which you're still going to be sadly.
Yes, as professional singers, we haven't made a nickel. We paid some money, but not. Well, maybe once I got paid not to sing. I don't know whether everybody has one of these.
The hymn book.
The hymn book. There is solidarity forever.
It's kind of funny, Bob and I were discussing this on the way here, and it's like, well, you know the words. It's like, no. I know the chorus. I didn't know there was this many verses. A lot of verses.
Which we are not singing all the verses.
And once again, we were nominated for this duty, so let's do it. But I think there's another song.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is what we do remember. I remember Roy singing as a group and union stuff, and so we never really learned the words. The song that we do remember Roy singing is, ready? I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. They are standing in a row. And that's all we know.
That was our iPad in the car. We got to sing. So, if you want us to do the other one,
Oh yeah, and you're gonna have to help because we're only starting this.
and we're only singing maybe a chorus or two because we don't want to.
Because we suck. I think I did. Can anybody hear that? Okay, help. Please help us. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union is inspiration through the work goes around, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet no force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Now I think we can stop if you want to and have those cookies.